All right, on this rocking afternoon, welcome to the TrustedSec webinar on addressing endpoint challenges of a suddenly remote workforce with Azure. Really appreciate you joining, and let me give you a little bit of overview about TrustedSec before we get started here. At TrustedSec, we start with the most challenging aspect of security, and that's really understanding the real-world effectiveness of your existing security controls against a skilled hacker. And so we use cutting-edge techniques to do that, and this company was founded on that principle. Through our industry-leading attack intelligence research team, we've created several de facto tools and standards in security, which is critical because the better the research, the better information to understand, again, those real-world effectiveness of your defenses. And so when you align that information with the regulations and risks to the business, we really seek to provide more value than anyone else to build your security posture in the most cost-effective way. In looking at the full life cycle of your program, TrustedSec can help with building your program, that risk, program assessments, compliance reviews, and readiness, testing, which is not only penetration testing, but also we're getting into a lot of different testing, cloud platform testing, customized testing, IoT testing, etc. Quite a bit going on there. We also help with fixing your program from remediation, which we'll be talking about some today, but also training. We rolled out a lot of new online training today, so or this lately, so make sure you check that out. And finally, we also help with responding to any incidents your program has. Today, we'll be diving in and focusing on remediation, which really only tells half the story. We'll also be helping with review of baselines, advanced configuration and hardening that they can do, automation, which is some of the things we'll be talking about today. How do you help automate those tasks and systems to make your program simpler and more consistent? So before we get started, again, just a couple of housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded. Not sure the music made it, but the rest of it is. A full replay will be available, and definitely ask any questions. Make sure you put them into the Q&A section, and we'll look to get those towards the end of the webinar. So with that, I'll turn it over to our esteemed presenters today, Paul and Phil. Paul, take it away.
Excellent. Thank you, Stephen, for the introduction. My name is Paul Sems. I'm the practice lead for our remediation team. And with me today is Phil. Real quick, a little bit about me and my background. Been in IT my entire life. Been focused in at all different levels, from a network engineer to 10 years as a CIO for a large organization to running a regional MSP. So been around and been in a lot of different situations, but glad to be part of the TrustedSec team. And we're going to be talking about a great topic today that has a lot of challenges, and we think we have some really good solutions to that. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Phil to do a quick intro.
Hi, everyone. I'm Phil Rowland, security consultant in the remediation services team here at TrustedSec. Like Paul, I have been in IT for my entire career. Started doing a little bit of development work, and then moved into IT services as a team lead, IT director, and then also my last role was as a senior engineer at an MSP, which helps a lot to understand the challenges that small to mid-sized businesses are going through. For the last probably 5 years or so, I've been focusing primarily on security, so building security processes into IT operations, some incident response, preparation, continuity planning, and those sorts of things.
Excellent. Thanks, Phil. So this is going to be a topic today that is quite relevant, right? So a lot of us are dealing with significant changes. We're talking with our clients on a pretty regular basis about this dramatic shift that's taken place. You know, not only is it difficult to get a haircut and things like that, but we're seeing a lot of things change. And when systems were designed, you know, as engineers, we look at things and we say, what are the parameters? What is the normal? What what can we design for? And we designed those systems and those solutions with certain parameters. And those parameters are now completely different. And I'm going to go through some of those. And this is going to be kind of a conversation that we have. And it's going to have some good dialogue here. And we're going to jump into the topic. So, we look at the word from few to most, right? So previous to the outbreak, we had the pandemic, we had few people working from home, 10% of people maybe. Some organizations had zero. They actually had strict no work from home policies. And now most people are working from home. We look at designing around this idea that, they're always going to be on our LAN. They're never going to work remote. That's a huge shift. And now the reality is those laptops and those PCs are never in the office. They're never connected to the local area network to get their updates and things like that. This other thing is never becomes always. They're always going to now, be out on a network that we don't control. High to low, major shift here. We're used to high bandwidth. Oh yeah, we'll store that update. We'll store that, group policy setting. We'll do whatever. We have high bandwidth, no problem. We can push down a 100 meg patch, a 500 meg patch, no problem. That's no longer the case. We're bottlenecked around things. And again, low latency and to now high latency. All of those things are going to give us some challenges. And even more significantly, when we get into endpoint management. Phil, did you want to jump in on that one, or would you anything there? Any other thoughts?
You got it.
Yeah. So we have some challenges managing these endpoints. So Phil, tell me a little bit about some of these things. What happens when you get into maintaining updates? Talk to me about that.
Yeah. So traditionally, prior to the latest revisions of Windows 10, you would have an on-premise Windows Update server that you could use to approve updates, cache copies of those updates, so you only had to download it once per location. Those sorts of boundaries are gone now. So Windows updates are now having to be downloaded to each endpoint, to people at their houses. You can't get reporting back from them very easily. You don't know which endpoints are patched and which aren't. You almost have to blindly trust the Windows 10. Hopefully you've got Windows 10. And blindly trust that system that it's actually downloading and applying those patches.
Yeah, so a lot of those things we're relying upon those words that we're using before. They're always connected, right? So we were able to kind of make some assumptions, and those assumptions are out the window. So talk to me about remote access. What are some of the challenges we have there now?
Yeah, so same sort of thing. A lot of companies used on-premise file servers. Your CRM service might be on-prem. You might have an ERP system inside your production facility that is now, all those people who need to be able to access those systems, now they've got to log into the VPN, or you've got to have some sort of other remote access technology. And so those sorts of technologies, you've got to very quickly bring those up to scale.
And when we're getting on the configuration of that, I know a lot of ERP systems require specific group policy settings or registry settings. And now that we don't have group policy able to go out there, that could really hinder things, huh?
Yeah, absolutely.
What about, and tell me about remote support. I mean, that's got to be crazy. I mean, before we could walk over to John or to Sally or to Sue and help them. We have a whole new paradigm here, don't we?
Yeah, well, and not just the being able to walk over to somebody's desk, but also just the applications that you use to support endpoints.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of them assume that you're on a trusted network, and they check in with maybe a local server that they're using to manage those connections and who has access to which endpoints. Pushing scripts to fix things behind the scenes, those sorts of things now all have to be shifted so that they can be checked into remotely. They can actually log into some cloud service or something to get those commands.
Yep. I know a lot of people in the past would just be using the standard Windows tools, right? They would use their standard remote desktop or backslash hostname $C and put a file where it needed to be. Maybe not the best practices.
Yeah, hopefully that Windows share is not open to the internet.
We hope so. There's another important problem here. what about YouTube, right?
Right. Yeah. So now, yeah, you know, a lot of times the VPN technologies tunnel all of the traffic that your users are going through, including like their Facebook or YouTube. Um, all those things now tunnel back through your main headquarters, which can cause some bandwidth challenges.
Especially over those VPN connections, right? I mean, you used to have maybe 10 people or 100 people or 1,000 people, and now it's not 10. That 10 became 100. That
Right.
1,000 became 10,000. And for some of our clients, you know, they went from, you know, maybe about 10,000 people connecting remotely to 60,000. And it's just crazy. So, yeah.
And it happens to the best of us too. I mean, I've caught myself, you know, downloading the latest Windows ISO and oops, I forgot to turn my VPN off.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And then we have the Zoom, the whole Zoom thing, right? Zoom meetings and remote password resets. All those become huge challenges. Tell me a little bit about the remote password reset. I mean, you know, that's an interesting one because we used to use the idea that they were on premise to be able to solve that, and now we can't. So tell me,
Yeah, so there's a couple challenges there. One is from the forcing somebody to reset their password, or you know, just the password has expired. How does the endpoint know that without being able to contact a domain controller? So again, we're relying on these VPN technologies. But also, if they do reset their password, you know, let's say the Windows endpoint knows, okay, 90 days is up, you've got to change your password. The domain controller doesn't necessarily know about that unless they've been diligent about connecting their VPN.
Yeah. And that's part of that all leads us to these problems that we're going to talk about how we're solving here is you know, things like group policy, which is kind of essential. It's kind of like the baseline. It's where, you know, most of our baselining work takes place is through group policy. It just won't work anymore. And so there's got to be a better way. So, you know, with those remote access challenges, we kind of have to restart our thinking. And so what we're thinking is, why don't we start from the beginning, right? Let's start with, we have to kind of rethink the essentials. And the essentials in a lot of places was defined by group policy. You would start with a group policy that says, hey, this is our security baseline. This is where we're going to force our users to turn off remote desktop and do those other things. And in those words that we're using before, in a highly connected environment, that's not really that big of a deal. It can take place. But now we're dealing with a situation where we don't know the state. And so there's got to be a better way. And so why don't I ask you some questions about this thing? Because we've heard about it, state configuration, this idea, it's been along in DevOps, in the DevOps world, and now it's kind of moving over to operational, you know, daily operations and managing of endpoints. Let's talk a little bit about that. Tell me about, you know, state configuration and kind of what's going on in that space.
Yeah, so from a high level, state configuration, you know, previously known as desired state configurations, is a way that you can specify a list of configuration items that you want the system to make sure it enforces on a computer. The idea behind this is so that you can create one configuration and have a couple different ways of configuring it. Maybe you've got a web server and then you've got a file server, and you can put all those configuration pieces into a file. And then when you deploy new infrastructure, you just hand it that configuration file and the computers get to work setting up themselves as you intended them to. And so, you know, again, it kind of started with a DevOps mindset. How do we very quickly roll up a new set of instances? But the cool thing behind that is you can actually control more than just new instances. You can actually maintain the configuration of existing stuff. So the real benefit is Microsoft has open sourced this configuration. So there are local configuration management services for both, you know, Windows, Linux, Mac. You know, a lot of mobile operating systems have management services for state configurations that use the same language.
And that's a way different than group policy, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, group policy is you know, Windows only, basically.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about some of those other differences that we can even just see in those first two bullet points. With group policy, right? I can do all this with group policy. I just set the setting and I go there and I send it out. Well,
Yeah.
You know, why wouldn't I continue to use group policy? What's some of the differences there?
So with group policy, obviously there's a lot of complexity behind how those objects get applied and who's logging into which computer and what OU they're in. So there's a lot of complexity there that can kind of be hard to parse. But also you have to have the domain controller infrastructure. So if you have to make a change to your security policy, or you're pushing out some new setting, or you want to install some new software, and you're doing that through group policy, you have to wait for your users to connect to the VPN, log in, have it push all that stuff down from the domain controllers. And all of that's going over your VPN.
Which is going to be challenged to begin with, right?
Yep. So we've got all those other infrastructure challenges. And then, group policy doesn't have a really robust way of reporting back the status unless you have access to query that endpoint directly. So it does have some status reporting utilities built in, but you've got to be able to communicate with that endpoint real time to get those reports.
Yeah, and that could be a challenge, right? I mean, we don't know when they're going to connect, and without getting access to it, it's kind of challenging. What about those other things that a lot of people use group policy to push out files and do installs? Is the thing you're talking about able to help with that?
Yes. So state configs can definitely push files. It actually has a really unique way of going about it. Rather than issuing commands to go download a file, it says, I want the file from this URL to exist in this folder.
Cool.
And every time, by default, every 15 minutes, every time that service runs, it checks the folder, it checks the online version, makes sure that they're the same. And if there's something different, maybe the online file has been updated, it sees that that's updated, and it goes and it grabs a copy and it puts it down in that folder. And so using a set of, pushing files and then running some scripts, you can actually use that to install pretty much any piece of software you want.
Yeah, and that's pretty cool because from what you're telling me, combining that with any operating system, we now have a way to, make sure certain bits are pushed out to both Linux boxes, Mac boxes, to all sorts of places. That's pretty cool. Yeah. What about services? I know, making sure certain services aren't running is super critical, or making sure certain services are. Tell us a little bit about services.
So yeah, it's same sort of thing there. With group policy, there is a way to do it, but it's pretty strict, and there isn't really a lot of flexibility around that. Once you've disabled a service, it just can't run, which in some cases is good, but also there are some times you want services to not run all the time, but you want a local administrator to be able to run that. So, update services or things like that. And so the configuration model lets you, again, set a desired state for those services. And then every 15 minutes it checks. And if something has changed, maybe somebody's made a change to that service in order to make something work temporarily, it can then automatically revert them back to the state that you wanted.
Pretty cool. Pretty cool stuff. And on the registry keys, I know that sometimes is a challenge, especially working in group policy, because you can set a registry key, but how would you iterate through, a registry key for all these dynamically created network addresses and stuff like that? That's tell us a little bit about that. And then we're gonna jump into a demo. So I want everyone to know on the line that we're gonna actually demo how this works in just a few minutes. So stand by for that. That's going to be pretty cool because I know this is a dramatic change and it gives us so much power, and we just want to go through that. So tell me a little bit about the idea of registry keys, and especially dynamic ones and things like that.
Yeah, and we can see that in the demo. I do have a registry key example of something that we can push, it does a couple different things. Again, it makes sure that it's present. It makes sure that it's the correct value if that's what you want. And then it lets those settings be changed temporarily. So again, if you need to do something, you've got all these endpoints out there, and you don't have you can't walk up to it and have an admin log in. So there are options that you can provide that let somebody who does have a local administrative access to actually change those temporarily, get something working, and then desired state config will put that back. And actually PowerShell is a perfect example of this that we can get into.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's going to be great. So one of the huge differences, the massive differences that between doing this with group policies or even local logon scripts and stuff is, tell me about this last bullet point here, this domain membership optional. I think that's pretty crazy.
Yeah, so the configuration service, the configuration management service is actually just a local service on each endpoint. You can give it a configuration file and it just goes to work making sure that that configuration exists. And so tying this in with something like Azure gives us the ability to, without a domain at all,
Wow.
push files, push configuration scripts down to these endpoints.
Yeah, I think that's pretty amazing. I think recently, what we've noticed is that DSC, or desired state configuration, these state configurations, they're great ideas, but they really only worked kind of in a controlled environment. Let's take a look at what's going on now with Azure. Tell us a little bit about that. Combining these two things. Tell us what does that look like?
Yeah, so Azure, quote unquote, the cloud, brings a lot of benefits. So the VPN, you don't need a VPN to connect to Azure. You can make things securely accessible publicly to your endpoints. Cloud authentication, again, so you get all the benefits of the modern authentication mechanisms that Microsoft and all these other cloud providers are coming out with. Multi-factor is a checkbox away, so you can add a lot of security really easily. OneDrive CRM, so all your services are available online. You don't have to have data coming in and out of your main offices just for accessing cloud stuff. Intune auto enrollment, so you have to deploy a new workstation. You just send them the hardware. When they log in with their email address, it can talk to Azure directly, uses their real corporate password, and then enrolls that device in Intune so that you can start managing it remotely without ever having to touch it. And then the thing we're talking about today, state configurations, right? So once you've got access to that through Intune, you can pretty easily push down an enrollment script to enroll that in desired state configurations. And then from there, the world is your oyster.
Perfect. So like Intune, so I want to talk real quick before we jump into the demo, because the demo is really exciting. So Intune gets us started, right? It kind of gets the secure, some of the basic hardening done, but it's definitely far from complete. It's nowhere close to some of the CIS benchmarks or any
I
of
think
the
it was
standards.
something like 15, somewhere between 15 and 20% of the CIS benchmarks are available to be configured through the Intune stuff.
And that's with everything turned on.
Yeah. That's everything turned on. There's a whole lot of other registry settings that don't get set that group policy normally manages.
Yeah. So Intune's great. It gets you started, and we do recommend, if you don't have a solution for that, definitely, that's a first place to start. But it's only 15% of the solution, and it doesn't allow you to do some other things. Cool. I think we're ready for a demo. This is really exciting. So tell us a little bit about what we're going to be seeing in this demo, and then take it over.
Yeah. So here I'll share my screen here. So what we're going to walk through here is a really brief sampling of some of the things that they can do with a configuration file. And then I'll show you real quick. It's super easy to push this out with Azure. I already have my demo box enrolled, just we skip that. And then I'll show you on a demo virtual machine, those settings actually getting applied real time, and then what the reporting looks like.
Cool. So are you in anything special? Is that, what are we looking at?
Oh, I'm just using the free version of Visual Studio Code. Apologize for the dark screen.
That's fine.
And yeah, this is actually a really short configuration file. This would normally be, if you had to write all of this in code, it would be 100 lines or so to make all of these changes. And again, you can do this in group policy, but you have all those other challenges. So
just so we're super clear on this, so with these desired state configuration, DSC or state configuration, you're actually able to do this in code. You don't need a special GUI. You don't need to do anything special. This is just our standard text file, right? We're just working on a regular PowerShell file here.
Yeah, so I actually am only using this as a PowerShell file. It is required to be a PowerShell format.
Yep.
And I'm just using Visual Studio Code so that I can see the coloring. It makes it easier for me.
And you're actually on a Mac doing this.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, walk us through what a typical configuration would look like.
Yeah, so there's a couple. The other thing I did want to point out too here is that there is a large community of desired state configuration people who have created custom configuration resources that you can use. I've got a couple of them listed up here. This is actually the one that I'm using for this PowerShell execution policy setting. But there's a whole gallery in Azure of stuff that's been published and authorized by Microsoft to be used. So if it's not available in the already extensive things you can do with native DSC, there's also some customizability to it. But this first thing, this is a perfect example of how desired state config is so flexible. All you have to do is tell it, I want the execution policy to be remote signed, and I'm telling it that that's the local machine scope, which is the default scope. So if you've ever opened PowerShell and gotten yelled at because you tried to run a script, the first thing most people do is set execution policy to unrestricted. And then most people forget to put that back, which is a huge security gap, right? That's a big problem. So what this does is by doing this with desired state config, it lets that administrator set it to unrestricted, and then they can run whatever they want. And then, within 15 minutes, it puts it back to remote signed by default.
So to do that, all I have to do is just set that variable equal, and that works. That's pretty darn amazing, huh?
Yep, that's all you have to do. Same thing for services. So this is just a sample. This is the Xbox Live login manager that comes with Windows 10. So let's just go ahead and make sure that's not running and is set to disabled. So easy peasy there. This registry setting is actually the Wi-Fi sense. So it's the automatic feature in Windows 10 that will connect you to known Wi-Fi hotspots. That's a pretty big gap because a lot of people like to broadcast fake AT&T hotspots and things like that. So this is a way to make sure that gets turned off. And then this here is another cool example of the power of state configurations. You can actually push your own scripts.
Wow.
So, I mentioned earlier, if you can't do what you're looking to do natively within the desired state configuration resources, there's a community, or you can just write some PowerShell. So that's what I've done here.
That's pretty cool. You can't really do that with group policy, right? I mean, the group policy says set this one parameter to this, and that's kind of it, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, you can embed scripts, right?
Yeah.
But the problem with that is then you've got to figure out, okay, now if I want output from that script, if I want to know that it ran and that it was successful, I have to write a file somewhere, or I've got to in some way communicate. This handles all of it for you. It knows that it's a script. It tells you whether the script ran and whether or not this test came back as true.
Pretty cool.
So that's the script. Let me hop over to Azure here real quick.
Now we're going to be combining together this regular text file, this script, and this power of cloud-based, Azure deployment of this, right?
Yep. So this is my automation account that I set up for this demo. You can see I've got my one node here. I've already enrolled that and assigned it. So all I'm going to do to push this script is go ahead here.
Oh wait, can we look at the computer before you've done any of this?
Oh yeah. Well, right now it's in a valid state because it knows that it's. Oh, I lied. It's not compliant.
So this is a huge difference. Can we talk to this just for 1 second?
Yeah.
So this is huge. I mean, we're now, unlike group policy, with group policy, it's a wish list, right? Really, the reality is it's a wish list. I want you to set it this way, but we have no way. But you're telling me right now what we're looking at is it's telling you where it's at. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's telling me that this Xbox Live service is in fact compliant with what we've told it, which is to be off and disabled, and that execution policy is not what we told it, and that's because I have my demo set in an unsafe situation right now. Same thing for registry, and the script is also saying that it's not able to run.
That's pretty cool. So you're not going to get that with the regular tools, and then we're getting this out of the box. That's pretty cool.
Absolutely. So let me go ahead and go back, and I will push that configuration. So all we do, upload that file, which happens in, well, before I even noticed that it was doing anything. Go into the config, we'll go ahead and we'll compile that. All that does,
Yeah, go ahead and tell us a little bit.
yeah, so all the compiling does is it takes that PowerShell script that we wrote, and it converts it into an MOF file, which is essentially the thing that makes it OS independent. So that MOF file is it kind of relies on .NET, but not really. It compiles it down to something that every computer can understand, and it takes any of those dynamic features that we've put in, and it runs those and expands them into a set of commands that'll be pushed to the endpoint.
Yep.
So that's probably done. It does take about a minute or two, but you only do this generally once. Let me refresh and see if we're good. Yeah, so we're starting.
Yeah.
Right.
So it
all
also
that runs.
And adding security too. I mean, there's some security that's involved here, right?
Yes. Yeah. So it's obviously only letting you run modules that are approved. So again, you control within your Azure automation account what modules are allowed to run, and then those are the only things that are allowed to be compiled into your script. So there's a lot of extra security there as well. You can't just be hijacked for anyone's use.
And on Azure, it's to enroll a machine with DSC, it's literally just a click. Here's an inventory, add it. But for Macs and for NPCs, it's pretty straightforward, right?
Yep. Yeah, and this here is a copy of the script that I used to enroll in the Azure account. I did remove all the secret stuff. Yep. So you guys can't, nobody can be putting stuff on my Azure account. But yeah, this is all you would have to push with an Intune script, and it would go ahead and enroll it and show up.
Cool. Pretty cool.
So that's that. You can see here the demo status. This is why everything was not compliant. I obviously have set PowerShell to be unrestricted. I've enabled Wi-Fi sense. I've set NetBIOS stuff. That's this guy here. I can show you that real quick. So that is this NetBIOS setting that everyone always has to turn off, and it's such a pain. You have to script it, or you have to set registry keys. It's not easy.
And if you have multiple NIC cards, right?
Oh yeah, you got to do that for every single one of them. So you can see here I've got 3. There's only 2 visible, and one of them's like a Google thing. All right, so let me just check.
So what we're seeing in that bottom blue window is you wrote a script that just tells us kind of what all the settings are. So it's pretty cool.
Yep. And, yeah, this is just a quick way for me to show all the status stuff. So I'm going to actually go here and run this update DSC configuration. I have some extra stuff turned on so we can see what it's doing. So it goes, it checks with Azure, it sees, oh, there's a new version, it downloads the version, then it starts running all those tests to see, is everything passing? And so it goes ahead and it runs all of those tests. So now we can go back to our demo status here, and you can see now remote signed, Wi-Fi sense is off, NetBIOS is set to 2, which we go back here. Oh.
Administrator.
Yeah, I mistyped. Happens to the best of us.
Oh yeah, especially when everyone is looking at you.
Yeah, it's going to happen in the demo. So now we go in here, and you can see NetBIOS is disabled.
Cool. There was while we're in here, there's a couple questions that came up right in here, and I think they're relevant right now. One of them that came up, and we'll do a full Q&A after this, but can you use DSC to make certain endpoint agents are installed and deploy them if they're not compliant? So yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a software piece that you can add, and you can basically give it a version of a software that you want installed, and then you can give it install scripts for how to actually deploy that software if it's not installed.
So there's lots of flexibility there. Mm-hmm. Moving files. I know we did somewhere it was just, hey, make sure this not only does this file exist, but make sure it has this content. So it's really, really specific, right?
Yep. Yep. And again, with the combination of the file that you can push, right? So if the software uses a configuration file for its configuration, or if it uses the registry, all of those things can be pushed. And the other cool thing is desired state config gives you this concept of composite resources. So you can create a resource that has, the install file, the install script, the configuration mechanisms for whatever that software is, all in one package. And then you just publish that to your Azure account as a composite resource, and then you can include that wherever you want.
Yeah.
Right?
Now, there was a question Christopher asked here about does this require Intune? And the answer is no on Intune.
No,
definitely not.
absolutely not. So
Yeah.
you can actually see here. I have let me show you here. Get DSC configuration. Just run that here real quick.
So this box you're on, it's not managed by Intune or anything like that. It's just that if you use Intune, some people use that to get started. That's their jump off point. But no, there's no reason it has to be on Intune.
Exactly. It's a local service. The only reason I'm using Intune or Azure and why I mentioned it is because it gives you that fully remote, hands-off capability to push all of this stuff down.
Yeah. So DSC itself is available on all of the different platforms, the Mac, the Linux, Windows. You don't technically have to use Azure services, but what the Azure services allow you to do is they allow you to do what we're seeing, like compile it and push it and sign it. And they take a lot of the security, I would say, risks out of it instead of trying to set up your own environment for this, right? And and we looked at the pricing, it's pennies to do this. And so they're not technically part of an Azure domain or anything like that, so.
Yep, and you can even, if you already have some sort of endpoint management solution, but it just doesn't have the flexibility to manage, all of these settings for you, you can just use that endpoint technology to push the MOF file, which you can compile on any machine.
Yeah.
And once you've pushed that MOF file, the local configuration management service will happily enforce all those settings for you. Now, what you do lose some of the reporting in that because it's actually reporting back to Azure when I have it enrolled, but you can definitely do it with just a local service.
You could do it, but there's some low cost, almost no cost advantages to using Azure because then you can see what they're compliant. Another question came up real quick and we'll answer it while we're right in here is around DSC configuration for CIS hardening, for server hardening. It doesn't have the person's name, they're anonymous, but they found some DSC configurations for CIS hardening for servers. Have you found or used DSC configurations for IIS hardening? Yeah, specifically for IIS, we haven't, I personally haven't, but it would not be a problem to do those. That is not an issue at all. In fact, we have done it. I personally have worked with a client to get this done. Not just IIS, we actually put a whole package together that included IIS and SQL and a whole series of things and their custom app and some additional services.
I put together a DSC configuration that does the endpoint hardening for CIS, and I think I was right, just over 98% of the controls were fully implemented using just desired state config.
Pretty cool. So we answered that one live. So getting back to the demo here, go talk.
I have back to Azure just to show you that once a computer checks in and it runs through all of its stuff, you can now see it is in fact compliant. It took 3 seconds to run through everything. You can go through and see exactly which resource types checked back in. So you can see services, everything is compliant with the configuration that you've pushed.
That's pretty amazing. And so you can enroll devices, Azure devices. You could do this with Macs. You could say, hey, all the Macs have to do one specific thing. Linux boxes, pretty darn amazing.
Yeah, and not to forget the whole point that this whole Azure automation stuff with state configurations exists is for your Azure services, right? So if you've got Azure VMs already, you can absolutely start with this.
You literally just click a button, right?
And that's actually free. That has absolutely no cost.
Yeah, amazing. One of the other interesting things one of the challenges we always run into, you and I especially, when we run into dealing with group policy with our clients is there's no version control when it comes to group policy. I mean, yeah, you can install AGPM, the Advanced Group Policy Manager, but it's kind of kludgy. Tell me a little bit about version control and, with modern environments, tell me a little bit about version control and how all that works.
So just at least within one configuration here in Azure, it keeps every compilation job you've done, including the ones where you typed something wrong, as you can see here.
Yeah.
I screwed it up a little bit last night. I was making a bunch of tweaks and I kept running into little issues. But yeah, you can absolutely come back into a previous version and just look at what it was.
That's pretty amazing. I mean, you're using a tool like Code to go ahead and check that into your GitHub repository. So, I mean,
yeah, and there will be. Well, we're going to talk a little bit more about some of the long-term stuff that we're going to be going through. But yeah, there's you have source control. You can actually link this into existing code repositories. You can set up keys so that you can log into things automatically. There's this whole concept of runbooks, which is part of the Azure automation stuff that we'll talk about. So that's that's way beyond the scope of what we could do.
Yeah. So why don't we do this? So we're going to talk a little bit about some future states, but I want to open it up. There's any additional questions that came in right off this, any additional things, and then I'm going to start. We're going to get into our next.
Yeah, if you want to pop back to the presentation.
Yeah. There we go. Any questions that we have right now on this? Some coming in here. I know, Stephen, sometimes you have some questions that came in different channels. Anything from your perspective?
Sure, happy to ask them now if you'd like. What needs to be on an endpoint for this to work? They touch on a little bit, but maybe expand on a little bit more.
Yeah, so for any of the Windows stuff, the service already exists. So it's called Local Configuration Management Service. There's a couple prerequisites to being able to interact with that. WinRM has to be running in order for these desired state, like the update DSC configuration command. But other than that, once it's running, it's its own thing. Obviously, it has to be able to talk to the internet. If you're using Azure to push new configurations, it's got to be able to do that. But if you just are pushing a local configuration file, once it's going, it can be totally air gapped.
Hey, I'm going to have a quick follow up to that. I hope that answers that question. To get started with something like Azure automation, does Microsoft provide any type of, I think one of those questions came up too, any ways to get a demo environment, or how would someone go about doing that if they're not a Microsoft partner?
So Paul, you're the Azure demo guy.
Yeah. So I lead my own question there.
Yeah.
You up here, just if you are a Visual Studio, so if you go to if you set up your own Visual Studio account at my Visual Studio, my.visualstudio.com, just to let you know, you can set up your own environment, and you can use some of the credits. They give you some credits to play around with, and this is relatively cheap. You're not, it's a few cents per month per machine to play with this, but you could get set up with this right away, and we could walk you through how to do that. And actually, that leads us into the next area. Let me see some of these other questions that came in here, and Stephen, if you have some. Let's see, how would a tech unlock a system to work on it? So someone asked here, how would a tech unlock a system to work on it? So why don't we...
a locked system. So meaning the user doesn't have rights to log into it anymore?
Yeah, we need a little bit more info on that one, Joseph, if you want to expand, meaning they don't have rights, or...
So I guess I'll take a stab at it with what I assume is being asked, but yeah, if you want to add more detail, we can definitely touch on that. One of the things you could do, if there's a workstation that user can't log into it anymore, they've forgotten the password, there's no reset ability, you can push a user account down to it, or you can create a configuration that's specific to resetting, or running a script to reset a user's password locally. Assign that computer to that configuration temporarily until you see that it's compliant, and then have them log in.
Yeah. So you could. That's pretty cool. So the service runs as a service, and it has rights on the machine. So it's pretty much in God mode over there. So you could do all sorts of things there. There was a question around blogs, which is a great question because, hey, what is coming up? Tell me a little bit about what we're seeing here on this screen right now.
Oh yeah, the training question. So we're gonna we're starting a blog series about this. I don't know, Stephen, when the first one is going to drop. But yeah, we've got a whole series of things that we'd like to discuss about Azure automation accounts in general. The first one will be getting started with Azure DSC. So that's going to be a walkthrough on setting up your Azure account, how to generate the enrollment script, and then, generating your first actual, demo DSC. And I can put this demo DSC up as well, just as a play test thing to use.
Yeah, we're going to publish this. It'll be on the video. We'll have some links to the file. It'll definitely be available for you. Real quick on that, there was another quick question. We're going to get through the rest of the blog series. But while we're in there, they asked if this can be done on-premise without Azure Cloud. The answer to that is yes, right?
Well, yeah. So there's the original way that desired state config was created. I mean, this goes back 6-7 years ago, I think. You can create a local pull server in your enterprise, to publish desired state configurations to, and then enroll endpoints into that local pull server.
Yeah.
And then do all of this on-prem. You do end up with some of those same sort of limitations as you do with group policy. You've got to have the pull server has to be accessible. You can publish it to the internet, but then you've got all those problems. So
yeah, it is possible, but and we're a security firm, right? It is possible, but I think you would probably be significantly better off, even if you just had a separate instance of Azure automation just for this purpose. It doesn't even have to be part of the rest of your environment, right? That one service alone would be worth it. So, so more people are asking about the blog. So let's keep going on that. Tell us more about what you're planning and what this is going to look like.
Yeah, so there's a like I said, there's a huge community around desired state config, and the community has done a lot of really cool, innovative things. So somebody's actually written a set of scripts that convert existing group policies or local security policies into state configuration files. Microsoft is actually, I don't know what their involvement is, but they've published this. So the script can actually be run to grab you can export your local group policies that you already have and convert those to DSCs directly. We're going to do some advanced scripting stuff, so you can see, similar to the NetBIOS one that we did, but you can get into a lot more advanced scripting, and that includes the runbooks sort of things, which automate actions that you can take within Azure or on your endpoints. That's the runbook. Secure credentials. So, with any code that runs on its own, you've got to have secure credentials. There's a whole credential management piece to Azure Automate accounts. Version control, we talked about that a little bit. That's built in. How do you actually integrate with Git so that your configurations, you can manage those within your own repository and push those up, and then whatever else we think of as we go.
That's pretty cool. And there was a question from Patrick here. He's asking if this is available for more than just the endpoints, things like conditional access and Office 365 and all that. And the answer to that is I know a little bit about that. Is yes, it's coming. The concept is that it's going to be available for other things. So I can talk about the Office 365 side of it. So you can use DSC to help with Office 365. You need to have a PC that runs, or a system that runs that agent that is connected to Office 365. But yeah, that's kind of how that works, and some of the other things. I'm not sure, you specifically asked about conditional access policies, potentially, but again, it's ever evolving, and if we take a look at the repository, I'm sure there's the experimental ones where people are working on it across the board.
Yeah, there's a question here about WinRM, and the only reason I mentioned that earlier is WinRM is the way that PowerShell interacts with the local configuration management service to enroll in an automation Azure account. Once it's enrolled, you can actually use a desired state config to turn WinRM back off, and it's fine. It'll just stay off forever.
Yeah.
So, how does VS Code know how to compile PowerShell script into an MLF file? That, I don't know exactly how it knows, but I have literally copied my PSC file or my PS1 file into PowerShell ICE and run it, and it generates an MOF file. So something inside the running of PowerShell already knows how to do that.
Yeah, yeah. If you did it, you could don't VS Code is looking at it as it's the standard syntax for a PowerShell, so that's why it's doing the kind of the cool
Yep.
things, and then PowerShell itself has the modules that do the compilation and everything. You can compile it locally. Absolutely. When we were starting with this, Azure services weren't that robust, and so a lot of the testing that I personally did, is I would compile it on my local machine and see if it did what I wanted to do. So you don't need to, it just works with that.
Platform specific changes. So the one challenge that you would have with something like an HP or a Lenovo is they probably sign their code, or there's some other thing there. But if what you're looking to do is maybe push an update to Lenovo Vantage or make a configuration change, as long as you know how that software is, where it's storing that configuration, absolutely you can push it with a config.
Yeah. And the sky is the limit. And so, right, this is pretty powerful stuff. Can we talk a little bit about some of the things that we do in this space? Because I know some of the questions that are coming in are asking, hey, this sounds great, but how do we actually, do this? And is there something we could maybe help you with?
Yeah, so we've helped clients before. As you mentioned, we've had a couple clients that have needed, this actually solved a problem for them. So we dug into it and created some configurations for them. Hardening infrastructure stuff. So we do a lot around that. So we've got our Microsoft 365 configuration review that we do. So if you've got a Microsoft 365 tenant, we can go through all of those settings and help you know if there's any gaps in what we'd like to see for the security of that. Same thing for Azure, AWS, Google Cloud, local networking. So we do a lot of switch and router work to usually around some sort of a benchmark. So if you have to comply with CIS benchmark or some other compliance or management framework, we can definitely do assessments around that.
Cool. So there's two other quick questions, and then we'll start to wrap it up here.
Yep.
OS independence, and does it just ignore registry settings on non-Windows systems? So
So the way that it works with that is anything that doesn't apply would get ignored. So there's a bunch of stuff that you can push for the Linux stuff. I generally have different configuration files for the different operating systems because what you're trying to change is going to be drastically different. But that being said, services, the services function or that resource is the same resource. You actually just give it the name of the function.
Yeah.
So in this case, I was turning off a Windows service. You can actually use that exact same resource to turn off a Linux service. But I wouldn't necessarily commingle Windows configurations and Linux configurations in one file.
Keep them separate, and that's easy to do. The last question was around sharing this. I know we have the ability to share this, and Stephen, why don't you talk a little bit about where they would be able to find this to share with their colleagues, and maybe about some of the other events and trainings that's coming up. Stephen, if you got a moment, could you talk to that for a second?
Yeah, absolutely. So I put it in the chat box, link there, but it is on our website under events. And not only will it be up there along with the rest of our webinars from the past, but also you'll be getting an email with the link as well after this. So you'll be able to set it up. And as Paul had said, we have trainings coming up that have been starting to get a lot of traction. So obviously we're kind of stuck at home. There's not as much ability to get into a conference or what have you. So we're doing more online trainings. So that's on the website as well. So definitely check that out there.
Cool. Thank you. I know we only have a few seconds left, but I remember just a couple weeks ago or a couple days ago, Odvar went ahead and had a whole series on how to get around group policy. And I just want to point that out before I forget to do that. There is a blog post that was one of our colleagues posted on how easy it is to get around group policy. And when you implement something like DSC, that's not, a lot of those vulnerabilities go away. So just FYI on that. Another
Don't throw down the gauntlet, Paul, because now he's gonna figure out a way to check.
I know. Cool. Oops.
There was actually one more question from earlier, but what are your thoughts on users using paid VPN services or anonymizers from their home networks?
You're basically trading off one risk for another.
Yeah.
I don't know how, I don't know what you're doing that you think you need to be anonymous to your internet service provider. But if that is important, then just make sure you're using a VPN that you trust, because you're basically moving, you're moving your identity, the ability for someone to know what it is that you're doing from your ISP to your VPN provider. That's really all you're doing.
Yeah.
So just be careful of that. And there are use cases for it, but just know what the trade-off is and make sure you trust that VPN provider.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Good. Any other questions that came up?
Yeah, what kind of attacks are you expecting to see from more of the remote areas, and what types of things will this offset?
I can jump in on that one a little bit. What we're seeing really with these remote connections is that, the boundaries of trust, right? So, we're seeing people, how do you say it? They used to, on their internal network, they used to be blocked from going to certain websites and phishing.
Egress filtering, content filtering and things like that.
Yeah, and the solutions that people had because of those always to never shifts, they're out the window, and they can't flow all of the internet traffic through their VPN. They just don't have enough practical bandwidth. So what we're seeing is these phishing attacks show up, and they're not getting blocked because the filtering isn't there anymore, because they used to go to an on-premise filter. So things like Zscaler and those other open DNS solutions, and now whatever Cisco's deciding to rename everything they buy, those solutions are needing to, they're more and more relevant. We're seeing those types of attacks.
Isolated browsers is another really cool technology that I've been following, where you actually have a temporary cloud instance that's just a browser, and then you can actually use something like DSC to push the configuration to the endpoint that forces those browsers to use that cloud browser. And so you kind of regain some of that control of where, what websites are they going to? Is it trying to download some malicious payload? Those sorts of things.
Yeah, there's a lot. That's one of the threats. We're also seeing actually a rise in misconfigurations of VPN systems because of that rapid response to being able to enable everyone. People are doing things that are in the best interest to get the, hey, I'm an overworked IT individual. I've been in that situation, and we have to get everyone connected or we're not going to be able to ship the widget. How do we do that? And, people don't set those environments up every day. And we're seeing RDP ports be exposed. We're seeing other things that are less than ideal become exposed. We're also seeing, where passwords were only used internally and they were relatively static. We're seeing those policies become really, really stretched, right? So in the past, employees would only be on the local network. They didn't need any VPN access, and we really didn't enforce weak password policies, mitigations against those. And now those are being exposed through VPN, right? So that same username and password is now in the VPN users group, and they're getting
or even a hasty migration to Office 365.
Absolutely, that's a huge one, right?
Yeah, because now all of a sudden, all of the quote unquote login portal, which used to be a PC on the network behind a firewall, is now actually a website.
Yeah. So crazy. Well, great. Well, thank you, everyone. I think that is a wrap for today. We definitely appreciate you spending an hour of your time with us, and we hope it was useful to you. We know we had a good time sharing this information with you.
Thanks so much, Paul and Phil. Really appreciate you guys did a great job today. Very, very helpful. And for those, again, want to thank you for joining. And a reminder, there's Ask Me Anything on penetration testing tomorrow. So always check out those Ask Me Anythings on the website. Thanks again for joining and look forward to seeing you soon.
Thank you.
Thanks.